Dr. Jones, we've heard a great deal about you.
Have you?
Professor of archaeology, expert on the occult, and, how does one say it? Obtainer of rare antiquities.
Indiana Jones. Always knew someday you'd come walking back through my door.
When I was done with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, there was a reason that I invented the shot of Harrison riding a horse into the sunset, because I thought that brought the curtain down on the trilogy, and then we were all going to move on and mature into other aspects of filmmaking, and I never thought I would ever see Indiana Jones again, which, by the way, in a sweet, nostalgic way, was fine with me at the time. But there were some people it wasn't fine with. And I think it started with the fans. And I really think that the first rumblings we heard was about 5 years later. And I was off, doing a publicity tour on a movie I had directed. But I just remember people asking me, when are you making the next Indiana Jones? Now that question followed me everywhere I went in this country and overseas. I'd get asked the question, inevitably, sometimes not even on camera, are you going to make another Indiana Jones picture? And that was a question that was not only asked of me, but it was asked of Harrison. And I know it was asked of George Lucas. All of us have been asked that question. Harrison was the person that took it seriously. And he finally called me and said, why don't we make one of these pictures? There's a fan base out there that wants it. And my attitude was always, I've moved on and you've moved on and I'm making these historical dramas and that sort of thing. And Harrison was tenacious, and Harrison called George and got George thinking about it. Then George called me, and he said, well, Steve, what do you want to do? It could be fun to make another movie. And I was the holdout. I was the one that said, I'm done with this series. It was great. Let's walk away. And I have to give the credit to Harrison for starting the ball rolling, and then for George in working on me to get me to consider the possibility of more stories, or at least one more story.
There was an ongoing dialogue. There was a period of maybe 5 or 6 years where nobody anticipated doing another. And then we began to, each of us in our way, to think about the potential, the possibility of doing another. Having been out in the world making all kinds of other movies, I was happy to do another Indiana Jones film just because they're so much damn fun.
And then in 2000, there was an AFI tribute to Harrison. And we were all sitting there in our tuxedos, and we were watching on the screen, and we were seeing all these great clips, and people were telling wonderful stories. And we sat around afterwards and we said, those were really fun. Maybe we ought to do another one, and we really ought to focus on this. And that's how it happened.
One of the things that I was worried about was when we made these movies, we captured lightning in a bottle. So one of the things that struck me, though, as a concern was, will the audience accept Harrison? Because when we first began talking about making another one of these pictures, Harrison was in his mid-50s. And now he's in his mid-60s as Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is about to open. And that was a concern for me. It was a concern when he was 55. Is he too old to play Indiana Jones? And he wasn't at 55. And by the way, he sure ain't at 65. And I'm sure he's got another 10 years left in him if he wants to do something like this again. Because Harrison was the secret weapon. And it made me realize that Harrison was the center of this piece from the very beginning. The casting of that man to play that role was the most important thing we did. And when I realized that the strength of Indiana Jones is the way we fashioned this for Harrison, that was the key for all of us.
You're a teacher?
Part-time.
George Lucas had this idea for Indiana Jones, and it was basically, hey, let's do aliens. And I said, George, I don't want to do aliens. I've done 2 alien movies. At the time, I had done E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, not in that order, but I had done both of those pictures. And I didn't want to do any more aliens. That was it. But George insisted, and he didn't. He said, this will be like a B movie. It'll be like those 1950s B movies, Earth versus Flying Saucers, and all those exploitation movies that were really about government paranoia, Cold War fears and things like that, and Hollywood turned them into invaders from Mars.
It was the idea of taking the genre from the 1930s serials, action-adventure serials, to the B science fiction movies of the 50s, in the early 50s. And I said, if we move the whole thing into the 50s, which would be age-appropriate for Harrison, that would be the cinematic equivalent. And I wanted to rest it on a cinematic antecedent, like we did with the other one.
And I resisted, but I also never thought I'd be making Indiana Jones 4. So I guess I kind of humored George by going along with it, thinking, well, I'll never wind up directing this movie, though. I'll wind up producing it with George and somebody else. We'll get some young kid to come in and do this, you know. And then when we actually began to get close to a story involving extraterrestrials, Independence Day came out, which was a smash. And I said to George, I called George up after I saw the movie. I said, hey, this movie's really a lot of fun. It's brilliantly directed by Roland Emmerich. It's just got everything you want in a movie. It's got humor, and it's got drama. It's got things you've never seen before. It's got a mothership bigger than my mothership in Close Encounters, hovering over a city in broad daylight. I said, come on, we can't do aliens, especially since Roland has done his alien picture.
I then sort of thought, well, maybe I could do a kind of, you know, there's a whole genre of ancient civilizations developed by aliens. And I said, well, maybe I could move it into that, you know, without flying saucers and see if that would work.
So then George came to me one day, I'll never forget this conversation, said, you know, you might be right about this alien thing. Maybe we shouldn't do aliens. There's too much of that stuff around. I said, George, I love you. That's the best news you've ever given me. He said, yeah, they're not aliens. They're kind of extra-dimensional. I said, what? He said, ever hear of string theory about different dimensions? I said, yeah. He said, okay, these are interdimensional beings. They're not extraterrestrials, they're interdimensional. So I said, fine. And what are they going to look like? George said, look like aliens, but we'll call them interdimensional. But at that point, I thought that was kind of interesting. It kind of deepened the subject matter a little bit.
So once I started that, then we started getting on the right track and getting the script in shape, and then it finally became what it is. But it's been a kind of long road to get everybody to agree, and we're not going to do the movie unless all three of us agree on it.
So then I had this idea to bring in Jeff Nathanson, who had done 2 scripts for me, and he put some really good ideas together and gave us some guidance, some direction, especially on the story. He really brought some original elements to the story, and of course he has a storyboard credit that he shares with George, which I'm very happy about. But what I did later on was I went to who I call my closer, David Koepp, who has written a number of films, starting with Jurassic Park and Lost World. David wrote War of the Worlds, which I directed, and he's an accomplished director himself. And so I went to David and I said, David, I need help. And then he wrote the script that became the movie.
You kind of have to approach this movie as if the others never happened, but in the back of your mind realize that the rules were laid out previously and you still have to stick by them. So it's a bit of a balancing act, you know. And my feeling was I want to be respectful, I want to be mindful, but I also have to write something as if for the first time, you know. So try to have the audience in your head, but not have them in your head. It's a real sort of tricky line that you got to walk.
I think David's sense of humor is the key to the way that he writes. I think that's what makes his characters so endearing and accessible and entertaining. So the fact that he also has this incredible ability to write action and understand, you know, the structure of how that works and how you build upon action and how you make things more exciting and suspenseful and all of those things. At the end of the day, it's all about the characters.